Hi, welcome to this session on Ask the Expert. My name is Bill Burmester. I'm a psychotherapist in private practice in Berkeley, California, and I'm going to be talking about something I call post-traumatic masculinity and the contrast between toxic virility and daring vulnerability. Much of what I hope to accomplish in this brief presentation and later discussion is to introduce you to abuse survivor stories in books, articles, films, and videos, all accessible through my website, to facilitate a conversation about how men living with the experience of being victimized move from feeling broken to redefining masculinity as a healthy, full, and emotionally vulnerable and rich gender identity. In 2012, Dale Orlando Smith performed a one-woman play she also wrote called Black and Blue Boys, Broken Men, about male victims of abuse and neglect. This represented a fearless and moving expose of the costs and consequences of the physical, emotional, and sexual abuse of boys, and challenged the simplistic assumption that real boys and men don't get victimized or quickly put it all behind them. Since then, Western and perhaps world culture has been challenging and redefining masculinity as it enters a state of crisis, evident in the relative failure of American boys to thrive in education and as men in the workplace, through dramatic, disproportionate increases in deaths through opioid and other substance and process addictions, and through increased suicide rates. Even Fox News recently aired a four-part look at, quote, men in America, worth witnessing for its somewhat symptomatic doublespeak. This recent attention to the fate of masculinity here and abroad was inaugurated by speakers such as former NFL player and life coach Joe Ehrmann in his 2013 TEDx Baltimore talk on masculinity, and filmmaker Jennifer Siebel Newsom in her 2014 film The Mask You Live In. This documentary, let me move on. This documentary opens with a litany of toxic injunctions about being male in traditional American culture. Man up, stop with the tears, pick yourself up, stop with the emotions. Don't be a pussy, be cool and kind of a dick. Don't be a tattletale. Don't be a mama's boy, don't be a girl, don't be a sissy. Bros before hoes. What a fag. Get laid, grow some. I am struck by how many of these gender directives are sex derogatory, which is certainly paralleled by the misogynistic porn that boys are now exposed to on average by the age of 11. This is the fertile ground in which the Me Too movement has taken root, a crucial gender protest regardless of its understandable polarizations. Ehrmann and Siebel Newsom have been followed by numerous authors writing about men and vulnerability, many of them outspoken survivors of sexual abuse, some of which I note and link to in the resource list that accompanies this introduction, and that's posted on my website. They are setting strong precedent for the breaking of silence as an act of strength for sexual abuse survivors rather than shamed admission of feared weakness. Discussion of non-binary and gender-neutral sex identities are further commentary on the excesses of the toxic virility that lies behind the sexual abuses of children, including boys, and assaults on both adults of both sexes. And these toxic gender messages are promoted by both men and women. Trauma and vulnerability and gender. By definition, trauma introduces vulnerability into the life of anyone it touches. But for boys and men, it further challenges us with the gender injunction that to be acceptably masculine, one must be invulnerable and unviolated. This means that when boys or men are violated, sexually abused in particular, they tend to blame themselves and lose their standing as masculine, often a worse fate than the physical aspects of the abuse itself, since it leads to withdrawal, isolation, depression, addictions, and disability, all forms of disempowerment that worsen the so-called weakness condemned by traditional standards of masculinity. Much of the problem for male survivors and everyone else lies with an exclusively binary definition of masculinity. When being masculine means not being feminine, gender identity becomes a null category. It is an identity grounded in what one can't and better not do, which therefore risks being empty and brittle behind its veneer of force and violence. If I am primarily male by virtue of not being feminine in any way, I have to fight the feminine to feel masculine, and so I'm negatively ruled by it. But becoming the feminized male that toxic virility fears is not the only alternative. Our current discussion asks what a healthy non-binary, or at least non-exclusive masculinity and masculine identity looks like. My core point is that character qualities traditionally associated with masculinity, such as courage, willingness to take risks, and the experience of being strong, can infuse a man's relationship with his own sometimes vulnerable and overwhelming emotions. As Brené Brown and others have insisted, it takes strength and courage to inhabit emotional intensity beyond just lust and anger. It takes a coupling of gender qualities to balance and heal what I am calling toxic virility. I use this term in place of the more familiar buzzword toxic masculinity because virility already implies some degree of exaggeration, and most of those who speak of quote, toxic masculinity define it as a condition of extremes. A vulnerable masculinity, by contrast, starts as a challenging contradiction, but delivers a healing paradox. The root of vulnerability as a word, now a buzzword at risk of losing its meaning from overuse, is vulnus, which is Latin for wound. And the Greek root of the word trauma is likewise wound and hurt. So one might say the challenge of a vulnerable masculinity is to admit, accept, and stay connected when we have been wounded in relationship. When clinicians speak of trauma, we are generally referring to PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. In keeping with a suggestion made by military audiences being trained in the treatment of male sexual trauma, I like to use the acronym PTSI instead, post-traumatic stress injury, whose chief characteristics, just like PTSD, are 1, a traumatic event persistently re-experienced through involuntary distressing memories, emotional and or somatic flashbacks, and or nightmares. 2, attempts to avoid these intrusive recollections through denial, numbing, and dissociation, obviously including things like addictions and distractions, including work. And 3, the increased irritability or aggression that follows trauma, self-destructing, destructive risk-taking, hypervigilance and startle response, and difficulties concentrating and sleeping. This is a condensation of the clinical criteria for PTSD. It is a myth that vulnerability equals weakness, which is what I'm trying to address in this presentation. Fight against and flight from the more vulnerable emotional experiences implicated in trauma weakens us and strengthens them, because backing off from PTSI symptoms is debilitating, maybe even cowardly. To back off confuses difficult emotions with the bravery required to stay with them. Much of toxic virility can even be understood as further symptoms of PTSI, especially its avoidance behaviors. While few of us wants to feel overwhelmed, backing away complicates overwhelm by perpetuating and increasing men's relative emotional ineptness. This may be a controversial point for those steeped in a medical approach to psychology and psychotherapy, dedicated to the eradication rather than the experience of emotional pain. Let me see. In counterpoint to PTSD as a disability, PTG, or post-traumatic growth, has arisen as a complementary understanding of healthy responses to trauma based on resilience and emotional strength, which involves a willingness to learn from suffering. The best model of PTG may be Brené Brown's work on embracing rather than shaming vulnerability, and on Still Daring Greatly, the title of one of her recent books, in the pursuit of emotional aliveness and honesty. Her message is mirrored by probably the preeminent male spokesman for the Me Too movement, Terry Crews, a one-time NFL football star turned actor in 1997 and commentator on toxic masculinity in his autobiography, Manhood. He also recently testified to Congress about the sexual assault of men, including himself. I hope our discussion will question how boys and men react and respond to the contrasts, contradictions, but also the potential relationship between psychological injury and growth. The trauma I have in mind is primary relational trauma, as in physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, but military trauma, which disproportionately affects men as soldiers, also has its relational aspects, as soldiers struggle with the potentially overwhelming experience of killing others and the agony and grief of witnessing comrades they care about injured and killed, in addition to being the target of an enemy's intent to kill them. In fact, I may begin my discussion of cases with a brief mention and links to two soldiers, one from recent history and one from World War I. Clay Hunt was a young Texan Marine who served in Iraq and Afghanistan and as a rescue worker in Haiti. His story of suffering from PTSD and ultimate suicide was featured on 60 Minutes in March of 2013 and later led to legislation for the prevention of military suicide. Wilfred Bion, on the other hand, was one of the most influential psychoanalytic thinkers after Freud, but claimed to have died on the battlefield of World War I as a 19-year-old officer. He actually lived to be 81, but something died in him through his military experience. Although I cannot pursue it here, his military trauma deeply informs his understanding of unconscious process. Masculine attempts to cope with and survive abuse trauma, and the vulnerability implies, fall into three broad categories, as I see it, categories that can overlap. First, in the first, the victim identifies with his aggressor in becoming a perpetrator himself. He imitates his abuser in rejecting victimhood and instead transfers that role to the person or people he victimizes. This tendency is a core feature of toxic virility. In this context, it is important to emphasize that almost all sexually abused boys do not go on to abuse others. Research suggests on average 12% make this choice, based upon a UK study. The fact that the proportion is still more than from the general population of men suggests that prior victimization can still be a risk factor, even when not the primary cause. Boys, more generally, who respond to abuse with violence may be conditioned by action movies and mini video games to accept that response as the masculine solution to conflict. As the territory of forensic treatment, in the military abuse, as the territory of forensic treatment, I do not address this reaction to abuse further here because its dynamics differ and deserve their own focus. This category, however, includes sex offenders whose treatment is currently most innovative outside the United States, even though that seems to be changing. The second post-traumatic identity is one in which the male victim still identifies with his aggressor, but in perpetuating abuse against himself. A part of him identifies with his aggressor by attacking parts of himself, often his body, through destructive risk-taking behaviors that include drug and alcohol abuse, and addiction and neglect of self and health, self-care and health. This behavior can include cutting and suicidality, although both these behaviors deserve attention as attempts to solve real intrapsychic problems and not just symptoms of disorder. One of the most recent and tragic men to succumb to this solution is Chester Bennington of Lincoln Park, who, in spite of extreme drug use after years of escalating sexual abuse, starting at the age of 7 and at the hands of an older boy, developed extraordinary skills as a singer, songwriter, and performer, with a worldwide fan base that imagined him living an ideal life. He had a beautiful wife he loved and a number of children who he also loved and supported. And yet, he abruptly and unexpectedly ended his life in a moment of isolation and relapse following the similar fate and recent fate of a close friend and fellow musician, Chris Cornell. Some of you may know of these two performers. In the third pattern of response, the abused child taps into an inherent and often unconscious capacity to dissociate, thereby not only sequestering his abuse into largely somatic and sensory pockets of memory, but bypassing the full conscious experience of it in the first place. This may be a little difficult to understand, but it's the nature of dissociation to just absent experience from consciousness. It doesn't go away permanently, but it gives the memory of trauma is put on hold, and the victim may not seem seriously affected by it, but the child victim carries on without retaliating physically against others or against himself, while going on to develop the life skills, strengths, and resources he later needs to confront and survive the emotional chaos that typically ensues when these previously unformulated memories are triggered into awareness, and they typically are. This option may look like the weakest or least consequential response to abuse trauma, since the boy and man forego the use of force as means of retaliation and control. In contrast to the perpetrator's fight-flight reactions, this response may rely more on survival strategies of freezing and or submitting at the time of the abuse. However, these survivors often fare the best because they've not identified as victim or perpetrator most of their lives. The shock of being in crisis with the onset of delayed PTSI symptoms can be severe and life-altering, but these survivors often find the determination to recover and deepen both their sense of who they are and their empathy for themselves and others who have suffered victimization. I next present the story of Keon Dooling, a professional basketball player in the NBA between 2000 and 2013, whose memoir, What's Driving You, chronicles his life after sexual abuse at the age of 7, and after the breakdown he suffered from another random sexual assault 25 years later. Today, he's a life coach and leads a program that promotes mental health among players in the NBA. Although he feels his childhood ended after a 14-year-old friend of his brother's called him in from the rain one day, showed him porn, and persuaded him to get him off under the ruse of showing him about sex, Keon shelved the experience, told no one, and gradually made his way into the NBA, even though he never went out without a knife after that incident. Then one day in 2013, at the age of 32, while dining with friends and using the restroom, he was confronted by a large, somewhat drunk white stranger peeing across multiple urinals. Keon retreated to a stall, but left the door open, and the guy grabbed him from behind, with the alibi that it was just a joke he played on all his friends. With hands on either side of his assailant's head, Keon said as fiercely as he could, "Do you know that I can kill you right now with my bare hands? What is it in me you see that you feel you can do this to me? Who do you think you are that you can treat me like that? What makes me so inferior to you that you can treat me as a man like that?" These are excerpts from his own biography and memoir. Back at the table with friends, he told them openly what had happened, something that children rarely do. He did all the right things, from mustering the force to protect himself, to controlling his anger, but he couldn't calm down. When he finished and left to walk it off, he ran into his assailant again outside. Quote, "I basically blacked out. I couldn't control myself. I just remember grabbing him, picking him up in the air off the sidewalk. As I held him there, I grabbed him by the windpipe. I wanted to kill him, to be honest. The Hulk was in charge, and I felt like an unstoppable beast. I don't remember ever feeling like that before, so charged with negative energy." End quote. A friend who followed him out pulled him off and spent the night with him for his safety, but Keon still couldn't shake the feelings. Quote, "I actually felt as though I was in a battle with something bad and out to get me. I couldn't sleep. I was tossing and turning, and my mind was flooded with weird, dark flashbacks that I desperately wanted to go away. Flashbacks of gunshots I saw when I was a child, my pop in his casket at his funeral, lots of other hurtful, disturbing images that were all coming at me at once, especially from the time when I was molested as a kid. End quote. What followed was a very public psychotic break, given Keon's stature in the NBA, for which he was hospitalized and which increased his stress even further. And then he underwent a gradual recovery. Even with the help, eventually with the help of therapy, which he thereafter very publicly endorsed, he was able to claim, quote, "I know from my journey that after you've gone through dark times, your light shines even brighter. The pain you've endured turns into a passion to help others who are still struggling. That's why I'm not ashamed to share what happened to me," end quote. I quote from this story at some length, in part because what has challenged and seriously delayed the recovery of some of my most accomplished clients is a fear of their own locked iron box of rage. It's an image of one of my clients who I'm currently working with. Keon's journey is as good a story as any of the triumph of healthy masculinity over toxic virility, however, and there are numerous other survivors who have mustered the courage and strength to share theirs. As I was writing these lines the other night, my son texted me with a link to that evening's Daily Show, where Trevor Noah interviews Mike Shinoda of Linkin Park on the release of his first solo album. This album, which he called Post-Traumatic, facilitated and embodies the grief he passed through after the suicide in 2017 of his close bandmate and lead singer Chester Bennington, who I mentioned earlier. Chester was my original choice as case for this presentation. His suicide in the midst of phenomenal artistic and personal success raises many questions about the trajectory of PTSI. Did he just not seek or find the support he needed to survive? Or does his life and death push us to rethink our assumptions about destiny and the meaning of a life? Chester shows us some of his long-standing connection to death in a performance of the title song of Linkin Park's last album, One More Light, which will be my last slide. He himself addresses some of this mystery in a late interview that you can access on the resource list for this discussion on my website. Chester's destiny, as I see it at this point, was to deliver a message about our ability to suffer rather than inflict pain, or just inflict pain. His suicide made sure that those who were touched by him got this message about those whose souls are murdered for the relief of weaker victims. I don't assume that his gesture was conscious or intentional or suicide, but he's an artist who seems to have often operated intuitively. And just to think that suicide may have been part of that destiny is a very challenging thought indeed. So I end with paradox. The very experience of vulnerability that toxic virility strains to avoid and to project onto others is the doorway into healing relational trauma, even when the outcome is fatal. Once we embody the courage and strength it takes to connect and stay with the pain of past abuse and loss, which is the mission of trauma therapy as I understand it, the pain transforms us. Because of the refusal to face abuse, many men foreground the danger of a feared internal state of weakness to be avoided at all costs, and thereby ignore the acts of emotional bravery, determination, and stamina that it takes to face and cycle through the vulnerable emotions that abuse and other trauma evoke. And so they miss out on the way through trauma to growth. Once identified as memories, largely body memories and flashbacks, as well as narrative memories, incidents of extreme vulnerability from histories of abuse can be contained and metabolized while still very painful, and we become capable of speaking out about them on behalf of others who've suffered in silence, often under toxic gender constraints. This emotional openness to vulnerability and grief is exactly what renders fathers available to nurture and protect their children through the vulnerabilities of childhood. Actively caring for them is the pathway beyond the fear and toxic avoidance of the feminine. So I thank you for listening and invite you to visit my website for a list of resources for our upcoming discussion about the relationship between trauma and masculinity. And I'd like to close with a video of one of Chester Bennington's last performances from the title song of their last album.
Should have stayed, were the signs I ignored. Cannot help you not to hurt anymore. We saw brilliance when the world was asleep. There are things that we can have but can't keep. If they say, who cares if one more light goes out in the sky of a million stars? It flickers, flickers. Who cares when someone's time runs out? If a moment is all we are, or quicker, quicker. Who cares if one more light goes out? Well, I do. The reminder, pull the floor from your feet. In the kitchen, one more chair than you need. Oh, and you're angry, and you should be. It's not fair. Just 'cause you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. If they say, who cares when someone's time runs out? If a moment is all we are, or quicker, quicker.